Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance, and here's a look at some of the stories we're covering for you today. Virginians voted in an unexpectedly close race for governor. We have analysis on the results from the Commonwealth. And we speak to a Virginia congressman to find out what this could mean for the future of Virginia and the nation moving forward. And President Biden just unveiled his new plan to reduce U.S. methane emissions while at the UN climate conference. We had a chance to sit down with a former official at the Department of Transportation to get her thoughts. Tuesday was Election Day. As voters headed to the polls, the unexpectedly close race for Virginia governor has drawn national attention.
Alrighty, Virginia, we won this thing!
Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin has defeated Democrat Terry McAuliffe, winning Virginia's highly anticipated gubernatorial race. The former private equity executive is the first Republican in 12 years to win governorship in the state that has been trending blue over the past decade. Addressing cheering supporters in Chantilly, a Northern Virginia town, Youngkin promised to immediately improve schools, lower taxes, and build a new day for Virginians.
Together, we will change the trajectory of this Commonwealth.
Youngkin surged in the polls in the campaign's final weeks and presented himself as a political newcomer running against former Governor Terry McAuliffe on decisive issues including abortion, critical race theory, and former President Donald Trump. McAuliffe thanked his supporters last night in McLean, Virginia. Wednesday morning, McAuliffe released a statement conceding the governor's race and congratulated Youngkin on his victory. The election outcome is particularly notable as the top issue among voters has shifted away from the pandemic. A survey showed that about 34% of Virginians ranked the economy as the #1 priority. However, lockdown and vaccine mandates certainly played a role for voters. Republicans swept key elections in Virginia this year, scoring 2 more victories in high office for lieutenant governor and attorney general. The race for Virginia's governor has commanded the national spotlight. To further assess the results and the implications this race might have on national politics and the 2022 midterms, we spoke to Virginia Congressman Bob Good to get his assessment. Here's a look. Congressman Bob Good, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Great to be with you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Now, Congressman, your home state, congressional state of Virginia, big win for Republicans last night. What type of message do you think this was sending?
Virginians, along with Americans, have been suffering under raw, unchecked Democrat power. And the things that we've been suffering from are intentional on behalf of the Democrats. This is what they want. These are their policies on full display for everyone. And so this is truly a repudiation of not only Joe Biden's policies, but Ralph Northam and the threat of Terry McAuliffe, their policies that affect how everyday Virginians live and work, their ability to make decisions for their own personal health, for their families, for their education, for their work, those sorts of things. That is a direct repudiation of those Democrat policies.
Now, in terms of those policies, I have been watching all different cable news programs, and one of the things they're saying is that it was this invisible monster that the Republicans created called CRT, otherwise known as critical race theory. If anybody knows about this in the state of Virginia, it's you. You've introduced legislation to just expose this critical race theory. Can you just tell us, what is critical race theory and does it exist in Virginia?
Yeah, they want to pretend that just because there isn't a formal class called critical race theory where we teach students for a whole semester every day, 5 days a week on what critical race theory is, that it doesn't exist. Clearly it exists, not only permeating every area of education, history, explaining why things are they are, defining kids based on race, separating kids based on race, victims and oppressors and so forth, but also it's how the teachers are trained. We have just recently learned from news reports that Loudoun County and Fairfax County, 2 of Virginia's biggest counties, have formal training of their teachers on how to institute critical race theory, that kind of ideology, into everything that they teach.
Now, Congressman, let me ask you, what do you think the national implications in terms of the midterms coming up next year will be based on this election?
Well, it clearly was a national election. That's why the Democrat Party bought in Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and said, hey, this determines how the country goes. This determines next year's election. I think that's true. Virginians sent a message, as did folks in New Jersey, by the way, that they reject, again, dividing us based on race. The Democrats view everything through a racial lens. You know, Virginia is so racist in what happened yesterday. We elected the first African-American lady to be our lieutenant governor, the first one to win statewide race. We elected the first Hispanic to win statewide, and our Attorney General Jason Miyares and Winsome Sears. We're all proud of that because we judge them based on what they stand for, who they are, the policies they would enact.
Now, you just touched upon it a little bit here. The mandates, you know, lockdowns and vaccine mandates. How big of an issue do you think this was for your voters in Virginia?
I think it's a critical issue. As a matter of fact, I think it's the number 1 issue. And I'm calling on Governor-elect Glenn Youngkin now to not only stand against vaccine mandates, to say, hey, he's not going to require vaccine mandates. He needs to prohibit vaccine mandates in Virginia, as they've done in Florida and Texas, and say he's going to stand in the gap between oppressive federal government and Virginians and protect us from the Biden regime. Vaccine mandates come across or challenge our most basic of freedoms. Our own health decisions, our own health information, what we take into our body, what we disclose from a health standpoint, personal freedoms, our ability to go to work and to earn a living for our family, our ability to operate our business and keep our employees, all under threat with this vaccine mandate. It is something we could not have imagined even a couple of years ago.
Now, I want to ask you about election security. It's something on the top of many Americans' minds, especially, you know, with the last election. Did Virginia have any safeguards in place this time around?
What I was aware of is we had lots of boots on the ground, lots of folks being poll watchers, observers, trying to ensure that we had hundreds of lawyers at the ready to try to make sure election integrity was preserved. That should be a bipartisan issue. Everybody should want full faith and confidence in our election system, and therefore do everything we can to restore that with voter ID, signature matches, unmitigated access for observers from both sides. We don't stop counting ballots through the night, those kind of things to protect and ensure that everybody has the highest confidence in the integrity of our elections. It's fundamental to who we are as a republic.
Virginia Congressman Bob Good, thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
President Biden returned to Washington on Wednesday. He joined leaders from over 100 countries in Glasgow, Scotland, for the UN Climate Conference.
Today, I'm announcing the next steps to reduce U.S. methane emissions. We're proposing 2 new rules. One through our Environmental Protection Agency that's going to reduce methane losses.
Biden emphasized new efforts to reduce methane emissions, protect forests, invest in new technologies, and spend money on clean energy infrastructure. Congressional Republicans criticized the move.
And then, ironically, the 2 biggest emitters, China, Russia, are exempt. They're not even going to be participating in this folly in Europe.
Fox News has reported that a group of Republican senators put in a request to the Government Accountability Office to find out the total amount of carbon emissions linked to their travel to Glasgow. The issue of climate change has become a polarizing topic, and Washington politicians are in a gridlock over President Biden's climate agenda. Diana Furchtgott-Roth is former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and we had a chance to sit down with her and get her thoughts. Here's a look. Diana Furchtgott-Roth, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
It's great to be with you. Such an honor to be with you.
Thank you. So, Diana, I want to ask you about the issue of climate change. It's kind of a hot button issue right now. We're seeing a lot of it. We're seeing these bills that are being proposed right now. What exactly do you think is the reason that it's become such a political topic?
Well, it's a major political topic because President Biden was elected on the basis of pursuing an environmental agenda, moving away from fossil fuels and moving towards renewable energy and lowering carbon emissions. And that would be a great thing to do, but we don't really have the means to do it right now. We don't have the solar or the wind or the hydropower to replace the natural gas and coal and oil that's powering the United States electricity grid. And everybody wants to turn on their air conditioning and get cool air. They want to turn on their switches and get lights. They want to get heat in the winter. They don't want blackouts. But we don't have a better way of generating large amounts of energy and electricity right now. without using fossil fuels. So until we do, we cannot be phasing them out. The only alternative is nuclear power, which is emissions-free. But environmentalists don't seem to like nuclear power either. So we cannot argue with the laws of physics.
Now, one thing I can say is, I've seen more Teslas on the road, but the numbers for electric vehicles are still quite low, I think, overall. And why does that, if you know that statistic, please share, and why does it matter?
Well, last year, 3% of all vehicles sold were electric, and of those, about 2/3 were Teslas. There's been a massive recall of the Chevy Bolts because the batteries catch fire, and drivers are being asked not to park them in garages, park them outside, and not to charge the batteries to full capacity. There's been a recall of BMW electric sports cars, same reason. There's something wrong with the batteries. We do not yet know how to make reliable battery technology. Ever since the 1970s, the United States has focused on energy independence. And the past few years, we have had that with gas production, natural gas production, oil production. We've been producing massive amounts, and we have been energy independent. Moving towards solar-powered and battery-powered technology is basically making us dependent on China, so we would lose our energy independence. Most of the batteries come from China, the solar panels come from China. Many of the wind turbines are not made here in the United States, but are also made in Asia. And in order to keep our energy independence, we need to keep on making use of the oil and natural gas that we can produce right here, not just in the United States, but in North America, in Canada, our friendly neighbor to the north.
Now, it does seem like the infrastructure for electric vehicles in the United States is not there. So it's almost like we're putting the cart before the horse. And when you really start to analyze a lot of these things, of course, everybody wants to do great things for the environment. But when things don't make sense, what do you think the fundamental reasons are for this big push for green energy?
Well, the Democrats are very invested in green energy. They, I'm sure, have the best motives. They want lower carbon emissions. But to get that and to get to a net zero, Americans are going to need to change completely their lifestyles. They're going to have smaller families, smaller cars. And there's also, I should say, a lot of money invested in this. So there's a lot of money behind it. There's a lot of environmental groups that have contributed to the Democratic Party. And there's a saying, you dance with who brung you. If these are the groups that are contributing to your party, you need to go through with their policy proposals. So there's a large part of that also.
Diana, thank you so much.
It's great to be with you today. Thank you.
Recent polling shows that President Biden's ratings continue to fall. According to the latest NBC News poll, Biden's job approval dropped to 42%, and 71% of Americans say the country is headed in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, a Harvard-Harris poll indicates former President Donald Trump holds a strong lead in a potential run in the 2024 GOP presidential primary. 47% of registered Republicans and independent voters say that they would vote for him. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis comes in a distant second with about 10% of the vote. And coming up, New York City has been missing thousands of firefighters since the mandate went into effect on November 1st. Here in Washington, U.S. lawmakers explained why they're opposing these mandates. And the Cuba Libre movement took off over the summer, calling for freedom and democracy in the communist nation. We assess where the movement is now and where it may be going. After years of red tape and censorship, YAHOO has finally left China. The move comes amidst the CCP's crackdown on the country's tech firms. About 9,000 New York City workers, including firefighters, police officers, and sanitation workers, were placed on unpaid leave this Monday for not complying with Mayor Bill de Blasio's COVID-19 vaccine mandate. The mandate went into effect on November 1st, and about 23% of the city's roughly 11,000 firefighters remain unvaccinated. Many of them have chosen to take medical leave over the past several days. As a result, the department has been missing about 2,300 firefighters. The mandate went into effect on November 1st, and about 23% of the city's roughly 11,000 firefighters remain unvaccinated. Many of them have chosen to take medical leave over the past several days. As a result, the department has been missing about 2,300 firefighters. First responders across the country are facing losing their jobs for opposing the vaccine mandates. On Capitol Hill, some members of Congress explained why they're opposing these mandates.
Look, I'm pro-vaccine. I'm anti-mandate. I think there's a big difference here, and the mayor can easily just allow them to do that weekly testing option as they have been. Now, instead, he's short-staffing our firehouses. Some fire engine companies and ladder companies are completely out. This is putting New Yorkers at risk, and it's also putting those firefighters who are working more than 24 hours in violation of safety standards at risk as well.
I was just speaking to someone who's been serving for 22 years on DC fire departments. And so, yeah, he's about to get his retirement in, what, 3 years, 8 years? And now if he gets fired because of this vaccine mandate, he loses all of his pension. The entire family's financial plan that has been set for decades is now completely going to go up in flames. And I think that is a real tragedy that should not go just silently into the night. You just saw the press secretary at the White House, Jen Psaki, who's fully vaccinated, and we need to pray for her because she's now come down with COVID-19. And so it's becoming very, very clear that no matter what, how many vaccines you get, how many booster shots you get, you are still liable to get the disease. To me, that seems like the opposite of what a vaccine is supposed to do.
People from all over the country who have been injured from taking the COVID-19 vaccines gathered in front of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. They came with a unified message. The vaccine does have risks that are not being publicly disclosed, and where there is a risk, there should be a choice.
My hands still shake. I had autonomic dysfunctions, so my kidneys quit working. I was having cardiac issues. My GI system, I was not digesting food properly.
This group is encouraging folks around the nation to speak up if they've been injured from the vaccine and to hold the healthcare system and government accountable. Just before the event, Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson held a roundtable discussion on the issue.
And they have not been honest with the American public. They haven't been transparent.
Why do you think that is?
For whatever reason, there's a policy that's been decided on that we're going to try and end this pandemic with vaccines and vaccines alone.
An event he says that he shouldn't have had to hold if healthcare agencies were following their safety standards. Senator Johnson is now working on legislation to combat vaccine mandates and the lack of transparency. The month of November could see a resurgence in Cuba Libre, or Free Cuba protests. This is according to Marcel Philippe, who founded the Inspire America Foundation to promote democracy in Cuba. Free Cuba protests inside and outside of the communist country caught the attention of President Joe Biden, who eventually met with the leaders of the Cuban American community over the summer. Here's part of our interview with Marcel Philippe.
Marcel Philippe, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You know, a few months ago, not even, Cuba was in the headlines. You know, the crackdown that was taking place against dissidents advocating for freedom. You could see it almost all across the board in the news. Now you're just not seeing this anymore. Why do you think that is?
Well, unfortunately, the Biden administration really killed it. Look, it's quite frankly was an unprecedented protest. You had thousands, tens of thousands of ordinary Cubans protesting against a regime that is known for killing anyone who opposes it, and a Stalinist regime in the 21st century. So it was really an extraordinary moment. And I certainly, a lot of Cuban Americans thought that the Biden administration would take this golden opportunity, not just to do something right by the Cuban people, but to switch the electoral tide in Florida. In Florida, most of our elections, we're considered a swing state, are decided by 1% of the vote. Now, Cuban Americans are 3% of the population, but we're 6% of the registered voters. We go out to vote in twice our numbers. We're very committed voters. And one of the things that we saw in the last election was 70% of Cuban Americans voted for the Republican candidate, for President Trump, even though less than 40% are registered Republicans, meaning President Trump had to take a lot of independents and even some Cuban American Democrats to get to that number. And any any Democratic candidate that gets 40% plus of the Cuban American vote usually wins the state. So it would have been a no-brainer for President Biden to really take a hardline approach on Cuba, stand with the Cuban people, and he would have changed the electoral map. It made all the political sense. until you realize the influence that the Marxists within the Democratic Party have gained and what the blowback would be to President Biden. And that really tells you all. The Democratic Party has failed to strengthen its base and instead strengthen the Marxist base within their party at their own peril.
Now, the interesting thing is you had touched upon that this was a moment in time with the Cuban Americans coming out to support liberty in Cuba, Cuba Libre. I was actually covering the parade in Washington, D.C., where thousands of Cuban Americans, not just Cubans, regular, your average American was coming there to support this movement. But I was talking to a few people that came up from Florida, and they said, this is something that I've never done before. It really gave you the sense that this was different. Have you seen things like that and heard things like that?
Yes, well, there's been a couple of different things impacting that. In the case of the July 11th protests in Cuba, they were so unprecedented and so widespread throughout the island that many Cuban Americans that are normally staying outside of the fray felt that it was the time to step up and to assist our family members, our relatives on the island. We really believed that the Biden administration would step up and address directly the Cuban generals and tell them this is the time either to side with the new Cuban Republic or to be the last dictators of a fallen regime. Unfortunately, the Biden administration chose to speak to the Cuban government rather than the Cuban people or the military, and we wasted the moment. But there's more than that. In October, during the last presidential election, we called for an anti-socialist and anti-communist caravan, and we had almost 40,000 cars turn out in Miami. This was not a pro-Trump or anti-Biden caravan. It was strictly on the basis of anti-socialism and anti-communism. And that kind of turnout was significant and unprecedented because I think Cuban Americans are seeing each day things in the United States that are very, very troubling and very, very familiar. It's things that we had seen in Cuba in the past. And I think that we're determined not to let that happen here.
Marcel Philippe, thank you.
Thank you very much.
YAHOO, the American tech company, said Tuesday it has pulled out of China, citing an increasingly challenging operating environment. Yahoo's official withdrawal came after years of the company's services having already been blocked by China's digital censorship. The company's statement cited an increasingly challenging business and legal environment and says it remains committed to the rights of our users and free and open internet. Yahoo's services are no longer accessible from mainland China as of November 1st. An organization advocating for transportation industry employees said the reason for American Airlines cancellations of over 1,500 flights last weekend was due to stress. A spokesperson for U.S. Freedom Flyers, a nonprofit advocating for medical freedom, said that pilots and crew were calling in sick because of the stress they are feeling due to the vaccine mandates. American Airlines COO David Seymour had blamed staff shortages and bad weather for the cancellations. Inflation coupled with supply chain shortages are uninvited guests this Thanksgiving. America's favorite holiday dinner is going to be noticeably more expensive this year. If the price of Thanksgiving dinner groceries seems higher, they are. Supply chain shortages, labor shortages, and government spending are impacting cost of the most basic goods, from turkeys to the aluminum pans that they're cooked in. Domestic companies and farmers are forced to raise prices as too much money chases not enough goods. According to the Labor Department, consumer prices increased over 5% from last year. The Producer Price Index for Final Demand, a measure of what consumers are willing to pay producers, surged by over 8%. And that's all we have for you on the Capitol Report today. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Steve Lance, and we'll see you next time.